The question is, in this country, when did we determine that we were children and the government was our parents? The bird flu isn't that deadly, but the government is.
I'm Stephanie Keith.
And I am Tara Manjakovic. And we are Unapologetically Outspoken. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. So for anyone who's been following us for the past year or two, you'll know that one of the topics that started us down like multiple rabbit holes over a year ago was when we started like diving into the World Economic Forum and the global agenda to destroy our food independence under the guise of, environmental sustainability. And we've talked at length about China and Bill Gates buying up millions of acres of US farmland, while at the same time, like squeezing smaller scale family farmers and ranchers out of business with these increasingly ridiculous regulations, not to mention all of the coincidental like accidents that have occurred over the last few years, the explosions, the fires, the oddly timed animal diseases affecting farms and ranches across the country. And we really haven't talked about this too much for the past few months because there's been so much going on with our clown show government. But we have done a few episodes on the bird flu since March, and we've speculated about the push to make bird flu the next pandemic and how it would be kind of like a 2-for-1 special, because the global elites could potentially use this as a means to not only control the people with lockdowns, but also destroy our food supply in the process. And after our most recent episode, we received a message from a listener, and she let us know that we left out some critical information in the episode. So, of course, we were intrigued, and we always welcome input from our listeners, especially when they have an insider perspective. And that is exactly what you guys are going to get on today's podcast. So we want to say hello and welcome to our guest, Glenda Bellio.
Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a surprise.
So speaking of which, I have to ask, when you sent that message, what was it about that episode that made you actually want to reach out and contact us?
Well, it's the fact that people need to understand how animals get sick and why they get sick, and the fact that we in the industry see a lot of tweaking by the government of our food system. And what we're seeing is more and more the fact that they're controlling our food system out front in the open, and also on the backside with just fear tactics, stuff that's complete BS. So people need to understand that, and they need to understand that, if you control the food, you control the people, and that more governments throughout history have killed more people through starvation than they have in the wars that they hold.
And can you just let everybody know what is your background in the food industry and how, with the connections that you have with like Farm Bureau organizations?
Well, Farm Bureau organization, I'll start with that. I got into it when I was about 16 because everybody thinks that it's insurance a lot of times because that's a member benefit if you want it. But I didn't have much money when I was buying insurance, and I wanted to know why I had pay this member fee. And so they said, hey, here's what it is. And I realized that it was a really good grassroots based bipartisan political organization that advocates for agriculture. Now, do I agree with everything they do? No, I don't. I mean, right now they're kind of supporting some stuff nationally that I personally don't agree with. But, that's something I'll work through from the grassroots going up this year in my state. Where I'm involved in agriculture is my family's always were a small farm. I mean, we farm ranch. They raised grain in this area until environmentally they couldn't really afford to raise grain. And then primarily most of my family members had gotten old enough that they just couldn't do it anymore. And everybody who raised grain in this area also had a few cows. And, it was easier to do the cows than it was the grain because you couldn't afford the equipment. And my uncle ran the property. My parents leased it to him. And then when my parents retired, they decided to go back to the property. And we ran a few cows, ran Black Angus herd, mixed, decided they weren't the best cattle you could raise by a long shot. My mom started looking for something else. We got into Normande cattle and we've been running them ever since. So we just have a tiny herd of them, and that's what we run. We try to be self-sufficient primarily because we understand the food chain issues.
Can I ask a question that is I'm just very curious about, because I've kind of heard little things here and there, but being that you grew up in this environment, a lot of people that grew up in this environment, are there a lot of people taking over their family farms or selling them? Like are people taking on that legacy and keeping it going, or is it just like we're kind of losing that with each generation and less families are owning the property and selling it?
Well, in our area, you kind of have two different types of farms. You either have extremely big ranches because they were, established a long time ago. The problem with those is as each successive generation comes along, they divide those ranches. Okay, grandpa started the ranch and there was 2 or 3 or 4 kids, and it gets divided between 2 or 3, 4 kids, and each one of those kids have 2 or 3 or 4 kids, and 1 or 2 of them so they become successively smaller almost as a whole because they get divided each generation, which then makes them more difficult to run. Or you do see a lot of them coming in, and the next generation doesn't want them, so then they get bought out by companies or groups of people that just want to use the property for hunting. So we have seen the loss of a lot of small independent family farmers, and the land going primarily for inholding for people to just come hunt on.
Okay, because I was wondering, like, do the Bill Gates of the world come and try to buy it up from people that maybe inherited it? Just because we talked about this a lot on previous episodes. It seems like more and more and more land is getting bought up by Bill Gates, but then also China, but then like our own government. And so I was just curious, is
Oh
this
yeah, oh
something that's
yeah.
like a big trend, or is this just,
No, you see it down here. You see, especially south of us, you see a lot of people, a lot of relatively rich people and people you wouldn't expect. Cuomo owns a property out here.
And you're
And
in Colorado, right?
yep.
Okay.
So there's a lot of rich people who come in and buy places, and they're little hobby farms. Not so much out here in the high desert. Most people don't consider that, real attractive. You don't have the trees and the lakes and the streams, all of that stuff. We're desert. We're sagebrush country. But south of us and west of us, there's a lot of timber country. And that stuff is all getting bought up, and the better farm ground is what's getting purchased. The better ranch land is what's getting purchased, and then it's not being used for food production.
What is it being used for? Do you know?
Yeah, how would I put it? To look pretty.
Okay.
It's just used to look pretty, for them to show off to their friends, to mow the lawn and have this beautiful place, and you can come ride a horse here or there, but they're not using the production. The hay fields and stuff can get used, will get used and mowed, but irrigated hay fields are really pretty no matter what condition they're in, as long as you keep them up, which means that you need to mow them. But primarily they're used for hunting and to look pretty and a place to get away.
So what is the talk in your industry when it comes to the bird flu? Like what's going in your circles? Like what are people talking about? What's real and what's fiction?
Well, pretty much what most everybody's talking is it's BS. It's all a big push to scare you into something or other. So here's a question for you. For you as general public, what do you know about the bird flu? I mean, how deadly is it for the birds?
I don't think it's, from what I've read and looked into, I don't think it's that deadly. It sounds like they're killing birds before they even show symptoms just because one tests positive.
Exactly. The bird flu isn't that deadly, but the government is.
Right.
Mm.
The government's 100% deadly. So if you have one thing that tests positive, it's like, oh my God, we have to kill it all. Well, what's the advantage of killing it all? We've just created a supply chain issue with lower eggs and lower chicken. Well, isn't chicken and eggs a cheap, inexpensive protein product for most people?
Right.
Well, if I can do that and I can eliminate your ability to purchase chicken and eggs, then I can convince you that I need to save you by supplying you with something else. Well, what's that new something else they're trying to push? Bugs,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I mean, it's one of those things that it's just like, yeah, this is sounds like a lot of BS to me. But they don't really put it out there as to, okay, you guys, here's how the bird flu works, here's who gets it. How is it transmitted?
That's the
If
question. How is it
if
transmitted?
well, it's got to be transmitted if they're talking about it by wild birds. Well, if it's so deadly and so bad, how is this wild bird able to fly from place to place and transmit it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they got to stay healthy enough to move. Most diseases don't want to kill you because if they kill you, you can't transmit them.
And that was my question too with the cattle, because they're saying it's been transmitted from birds to cattle, but we haven't heard about all these cattle dying. We just hear about them contracting the bird flu, and then we can no longer use these cattle as sources of milk or meat or whatever. But the
See,
cattle
that's
were dying on their own from the bird flu.
no, and basically from what we understand, if you get to believe them, which, in my opinion, it's really hard to believe the government, period, right now, they're saying that it affects the milk. Well, once again, let's talk food chain supply. Is milk an easy, cheap, not totally cheap, but cheap protein source?
Right.
Cheese, a cheap protein source. Okay, so let's make you afraid of this thing that pasteurizing milk isn't really good for you. When they first started doing the push to do pasteurized milk, there was a study that found that mice fed pasteurized milk, it sterilized 50% of them. So, but we want to make you afraid of raw milk. We want to get you off of knowing the person who produces your food. And we're going to push it through bigger corporations, bigger companies, and you have to buy it from the store. So we're going to kill everything in it. And then we're going to push it as this healthy product. Where if you actually look through history, you're going to find very few incidences of raw milk problems and more incidences of people actually being healthy with raw milk. They're figuring now that most gut issues due to milk are being caused because you're drinking pasteurized milk.
Yeah, that the whole thing with raw milk, that's what sent alarm bells ringing, because there is a huge, huge trend with people like me, moms, that, you know, are trying to be healthier because we're learning about gut health and all these different things. So there's been this huge trend towards raw milk recently and towards getting chickens. I mean, I feel like everyone I talk to is like, I need to get some chickens. I need to get some chickens. And, you know, so now that they're like specifically calling out raw milk and then they're going after chickens, I'm like, they're going after this because people are catching on to it and trying to become more self-sufficient. And then your message to us when you were like, this is a cheap source of protein, I was like, of course, take out the cheapest thing that most people can afford. And then the cost of everything else is going to go up, all the other proteins. I mean, it's just, I think this is clearly like our government causing this. I don't think the bird flu just happened to affect millions of chickens. Like, I think, of course, I'm a conspiracy theorist, but
Well, it's easy to be a conspiracy theorist if you spend just a moment thinking about the trail of how things work. I mean, what does a chicken do for you personally? You personally have a few chickens, you can get an egg. If the chicken quits producing, you have meat protein. That chicken itself around your property provides fertilizer as they poop, and they can provide bug control. Well, with naturally without chemicals. So who loses and who gains by you having a chicken?
Right. Yeah.
yeah. And then, you know, you mentioned like the bug thing. We've talked about that so many times because the World Economic Forum has pretty much put it out there that they want everybody to consume bugs. I came across something the other day that our own government, like right on the, you know, what do they call it? Like PubMed, where they list all the different studies. There are so many studies that our own government has done on bugs and particularly consuming bugs and how dangerous it is because they're loaded with parasites and it actually attacks your immune system and keeps you really sick. Like if you look at countries where this is normal, like they try to make it sound like, oh, it's a great source of protein, but there's actually a lot of really bad effects on your health and your immune system. And so the girl that I was watching a video and she was pulling up all these studies, she's like, they're acting like they don't know, but they do know. They've done these studies. And maybe that's part of it because if you're sick, if you're weak, if your immune system is weak, you're easier to control. So I thought that I would just throw that in there too, because I think, again, this is all part of a bigger agenda.
Well, yeah, and the other thing is like, where are you going to get your bug from? You're
Mhm.
reliant on somebody else to provide that to you. I mean, once again, when governments step in and think that they know how to best feed you is when they start starving their populace.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't
You
know
know,
if you've seen the latest push from Bill Gates, but he is endorsing a company, I think it's in California, that's making like a chemical form of butter. It's a company called Savor. And, you know, we're making lab made fats because it's, you know, reduces the carbon footprint. And he's talking about how this tastes just like real butter, but it doesn't release greenhouse gases and it doesn't need farmland to produce the butter. And it's like every time I turn around, this man is endorsing some other product that's completely unnatural. And it's crazy to me.
well, it is too, because if you spend just a moment thinking about that, it's like, all right, so I need a factory to produce that. So if I'm environmental, that means I have to destroy the land to put a factory on it. And then you have to get it from me. Plus, this butter he's making, he's going to use CO2 for it. Well, haven't they been pushing that? Oh my God, CO2 is bad. It's bad. It's bad. Well, nobody keeps walking down the road to say, well, what is CO2? CO2 is plant food. We are actually the lowest level of CO2 that we can actually survive with on the plants. We're at 0.04% in the atmosphere. We actually need to be at 800 to 1200 parts per million for it to actually allow plants to grow really well. Greenhouses actually add CO2 to their greenhouses to get their plants to grow better. So why are we trying to why is our government trying to take something out of the atmosphere that actually helps our food chain supply?
Right.
I mean, you just keep walking down these roads and you go, man, something's messed up here. Something doesn't make sense. And the level of CO2 is not going to hurt us right now. Well, it will hurt us because we don't have enough.
Something I heard yesterday that I wanted to ask you about, because it was the first time I had heard it, and it has to do with cattle. And I'm sorry, my son's being really loud in the background.
No, he's not.
But
I can even hear him.
it was around, like, first of all, around China buying up a lot of the farmland, because Tara and I, we've talked about this so many different times, and they were talking about how there is food insecurity in China. Like, by, I forget how many years, 70 years, they're not going to be able to feed their population because they don't have the natural resources. They don't have enough water and farmland. So they're buying it up here. Well, then they were saying that Russia is heavily investing in cattle. They said that he's actually paying ranchers in the United States to go and raise these cattle in Russia. And that this is Putin's like thinking about how there's going to be this food insecurity issue in the future. So he's like heavily investing in food. And this was the first time I had heard it. So I can't really confirm it. Like I just heard like people talking about this, but have you heard anything about like ranchers going to Russia and getting paid to raise cattle over there?
You know, I don't know about Russia, but I know that there's been a lot of programs where agriculture does share knowledge and people will go over to other countries and, teach them what we know about raising food and raising livestock. So it wouldn't surprise me, but my question is, why is our government trying to restrict our ability to raise food, yet these other governments are encouraging their people to raise food?
Yes.
You got to be a little suspicious of that. And I mean, you want to jump onto something interesting. How about the EID tags that the government's the ABC agencies, Department of Ag are trying to force on the ranchers right now. So they want us to put an electronic ear tag in our cattle so that they can track them, so they can save you from any kind of pandemic. Well, Ireland issued EID tags, mandatory EID tags to their livestock the spring of 2022. In August of 2023, they issued out a kill order for 41,000 head of cattle because of to save the environment.
Right.
So right now, I mean, here's this out of control ABC agency that once again wants to track all our livestock for the excuse of saving you. They need to save you from this, oh my gosh, disease, this scary thing that they really don't define. Or, oh my gosh, we need to save our nation's cattle herd that they have been doing their best to eliminate. And now they want to track it for no other reason than what we see on our part is so that they can come up with some scary thing and then come kill our cattle.
Is this going to be a something that you are going to have to comply with, or is it optional at this point?
It's kind of up in the air right now. We're fighting it. We managed to fight it once and bring it down. That's one of the issues I have with Farm Bureau right now and the National Cattlemen Beef Board, because they're nationally on the top end, not on the lower end, not the producers. They're kind of supporting this, going, yeah, we need to let the public know that our supply, food chain supply is safe. Well, they have some support, especially the National Cattlemen's Beef Board through the packers, that is kind of suspicious because the packers ourselves are not owned by American companies. And you get into the packer industry, that's a serious problem when it comes to meat supply, because you already saw during the pandemic how beef had a problem because it bottlenecked inside these packing plants because people were not working. Well, our government's done what they can to make it really difficult for small time packers to, butcher shops to exist, so that you can know me, you can buy directly from me. If you don't know how to cut up your meat, we have somebody who will, but he's only cutting up, 30, 40 head a month. So, but he has regulations that are so difficult that we can't afford it. You can't afford what he's required to do to meet these standards. So it's just like, well, that kicks him out of the industry. So now where do you get your meat? Through the big packers, and then our government pushed against MCOOL, which means that they have to label US beef, US beef. Well, now the rules right now are like, if it comes in from out of country and it's only been here a few months, but it's been here, we can label it as a US product. Or if it comes in as a boxed item and we rebox it, it's a US product. So we have out of country products living off the good name of the American cattle producer.
Wow.
When you first got a hold of me, I mean, I mentioned Bill Bullard with our calf. He's an incredible source of information on this. And our calf does not allow the big packers in on the board to make decisions for us. They are strictly producer ran. And if you want some really good information on some stuff, you should try to get a hold of Harriet Hagerman. She's a House of Representative
I
out of
love her.
Wyoming.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I see
she's
her
great.
videos all the time and she just like calls it out. I mean, she has no problem standing up to all the bureaucracy that doesn't make sense for our country.
I think what people need to question is anytime you have an organization, like, for example, the Farm Bureau, that is supposed to be supporting the community that's producing the food, and they're coming up with regulations that are basically restricting the producers, you got to ask, where is this coming from? Who's backing them? And it all comes down to the money and the government, and it has nothing to do with what's good for the people. It has to do what's good for the overall pocketbook for government.
Yeah, that's true. Like on the Farm Bureau's part, I'm not always so sure as to who's backing them, but you always need to look on who's backing them. I think a lot of what they're doing is, the government's really good at using fear tactics for everything. Oh my God, I need to save you from this. Well, so they push that. And then if an organization looks like they're saying, the government's saying, we need to track this so that we can save you. But the other side of it's going, no, you don't. We don't need to do that. Well, then they push the thing of, oh, look, those people don't want to save you and they don't care about your health. So it becomes back down to the populace just wants to believe what the biggest, scariest thing. I mean, it amazes me that people sit around going, I don't believe the government. I don't believe the government. But the minute the government comes out with something, they're all like, oh my God, we need to get the government to save us. It's like,
Right.
Well, it's like the message too with the bird flu, where they're saying, it has a 50% death rate, right? Because 1 out of 2 people died, so therefore it's a 50% death rate.
And we don't even know if
And
they died from the bird flu.
yeah, kind of like with the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Dying of COVID. Did you really die of COVID? And my other question is, so when we did that episode, I think we were talking about how they've started to test people in the cattle industry that are working around the cattle and testing them for the bird flu. And I read something last week where now there's like 70 confirmed cases, and all this does is get my wheels turning of they're just going to push this further and further until they, just start getting into the hundreds and thousands of supposed confirmed cases, and then just create this pandemic when there really isn't a pandemic, but it's a pandemic created by these fear tactics of people testing positive, just like with the COVID PCR tests that, a good portion of the time were not accurate. And is it the same kind of thing that's going on with these bird flu tests?
Exactly. I mean, some of the stuff that people need to do. Number one, high school mandatory reading should be How to Lie with Statistics.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we have these, we're begging people to come take and get into the research so that we can see if they have bird flu. But they don't tell you what the symptoms of bird flu are in people. Well, there's no reason it should have hopped to people anyway in the first place. And so far, the best symptom they can come up with is pink eye.
Right.
Well, pink eye is pink eye. It's not bird flu.
Yeah.
And these people that did die, or the one person that did die down in Mexico, he had other issues. He died of other stuff. He might have just happened to have bird flu at the same time. But you got to wonder, how can a zoonotic disease hop from birds to cattle to people without being messed with? Because that's not how they work. I mean, one of the people I love to listen to is the Weinsteins on Dark Horse. I mean, they talk about how this stuff happens, and that's their background as to how this stuff happens, evolutionary development. And it just can't unless somebody's messing with it.
I'm wondering, since that Supreme Court ruling where it basically is taking a lot of this power away from these bureaucrats, that, they can't just make up their own rules anymore. It has to go through Congress, and then the courts decide if there's questions. I wonder if that could help with, well, the food industry as a whole, but also with the bird flu thing, because are they still going to have as much power now to say, oh, we have to go in and test all these chickens, and we have to go in and test the workers? Like, are they going to have the power to be able to continue to do that? I wonder.
Well, technically, it should yank their chain and get them back under control, because they have been the ABC agencies. Sometimes it's not necessarily your elected official that's the biggest problem, because they can be limited to their power or kicked out. Well, these bureaucrats can be in their position for 40, 50 years. And how do you get them out? How do you get rid of them when they start becoming tyrannical? You can't. I mean, it's very difficult to get rid of them. So they sit in there and just think, well, I need this thing, or, I'm a radical environmentalist, so I'm going to make this rule and that rule and that rule. Well, we got to remember that they're rules. They're not technically law, and our court system needs to quit looking at them as laws. They need to look at them as individual cases and say, yes or no, this works that way. Well, the court system is screwed up too, because they don't go in and look at everything as individual cases. Our form of law and court system is that each one of your cases is supposed to be looked on an individual basis. But when you go in for any kind of trial, they compare you to another case and its rulings. They don't look at you individually. They don't look at your case and say, in this case, this is how we need to apply, and this is how we need to award or judge this issue. They go in and say, well, we're going to compare this case to that case to that case. And the situation could be similar, but not exactly the same. And it's messed up that you cannot just be judged on your case. So we have this problem with people coming in, making rules that aren't law, because Congress is the only one technically allowed to make law. and then they just run rampant over you. And then it was a problem in the Chevron case where they believed these experts, which we all know that a lot of experts are not truly experts, they're just opinionated and sit in some sort of position,
Yep.
are dictating things to you that don't even apply and don't work.
Right.
So
And
yeah, hopefully that'll jerk a lot of their chains and get a lot of them under control. But that allows the executive branch to have a lot of control that they're not supposed to have at all.
But see, that's where I think this gets dangerous, because especially in this circumstance with the bird flu. Again, I'm obsessed with the concept of the bird flu, because prior to the push to create this pandemic, which is what I think they're doing, there was no global agreement. And now we have this, global health agreement with the UN that the Biden administration has pushed us to become a part of. So if there is some type of global health emergency that's declared, and the bird flu being something that's affecting multiple countries throughout the world, how easily can this be taken and just run with as a global pandemic, which then takes control away from the United States to make these decisions and gives it to this global health power that we have basically just given control over to the UN for?
That's exactly it. I mean, the US needs to not. The Constitution says that we're not supposed to give our power to anybody. Now, can we sit on these boards and be aware of what's going on in other countries? Yes. But no one outside of our borders and no one outside of our elected officials should be allowed to make any sort of determination on how we're going to deal with it. We don't give our sovereignty over to no one. But when you start following the money, it's interesting who's willing to just hand us over to whomever.
Yeah.
So
That's a really
yeah,
good
I
point.
mean, this is when you start following the money and start following who's taking advantage of what and who's going to be the winners and losers and everything, it all gets pretty darn suspicious. Because my question here is on you. If the food chain collapses, which is a possibility, let's say we have solar flare that takes out the electric system, or we have a foreign power that releases an EMP above us, or we keep shutting down the coal-fired power plants so that we're reliant on unreliable electrical sources. In your own home, how are you going to be affected? You're not going to have a freezer. You're not going to have a refrigerator. The grocery stores can only get food. They get food almost every single day. How many people around you are reliant on the exact same source of food and energy that you are? And how independent are you from each one of those?
Right. I mean, all I have is fruit trees in my yard, so I could
Right.
try to live on plums for, a couple weeks, and that's about it.
Well, and that's just the thing. I feel like a lot of people started realizing that and getting like chickens and trying, to learn how to be self-sustainable. And now like they're targeting these people that are like homesteading or that are like trying to become self-sufficient. I feel like that's a big part of it, you know?
They exactly are. The question is, in this country, when did we determine that we were children and the government was our parents? When
Yeah.
did we determine that we had to be saved from everything? I'm an adult. I don't need you to save me from anything. I need you to leave me alone. And as long as I'm not hurting another individual, then it's none of your business. And that's the problem. The other question you got to sit here and wonder about, okay, China's bad, right? But yet we still get all of our medicine through China and we get all of our chips through China, and it's awfully suspicious that China's buying up ranches right outside of military bases in the United States.
Yep.
I mean, what is it? Is China bad? Or is China our savior? I mean, China's yanking our chain pretty damn hard, because what happens if we say, okay, we're going to war with China tomorrow?
Oh, we're screwed.
There you go. But yeah, we're still have an issue with them, but our government has done nothing to save us from China, to make sure that we have within our borders medical production, or that you yourself know how to use the plants and animals and everything around you to save yourself from stuff. I mean, what do we push right now in the medical industry? Oh, you got to go to the doctor. Oh, you got to go to the doctor. You can't do that yourself. You got to go to the doctor. You have an earache. You need to go to the doctor. Right?
Yep. No,
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
true.
And
I
if you
mean,
just if you take a look at something as minimal as, like, Stephanie, in your area, a hurricane, what happens when there's a hurricane coming? People go to
Oh,
the
yeah.
stores, they buy out the shelves. In hours, there's nothing left. So imagine
That's
if
true.
there's
Within hours of
yeah,
hearing, not even when the hurricane hit, like just hearing a hurricane's coming, the shelves are wiped clean within a couple hours. It's insane.
right, because people are not self-sufficient and cannot take care of themselves. And without these resources that we have been basically conditioned to become 100% dependent on, the majority of people in this country are unable to take care of themselves. And that's by design.
oh yeah, definitely. Because you won't look at me to save you unless I make you dependent on me.
Mhm.
There's a novel out it's a pretty good novel. It's called 1 Second After. You guys read that?
No.
Mm-mm.
It's the guy who wrote the novel based it off of a government report about losing the electric grid within the United States for a longer period of time than just a few hours. They estimate within a year's time, if we were to lose the electric grid and it not come back up, that 80% of the people east of the Mississippi would be dead in that
Wow.
year's time, just due to medical issues and the problem with food and water. Because it's not just food, you see the water issue right now down in Florida when you have the hurricane. Okay, so what are you doing for water when the water runs out?
Right.
Right.
If it's not going to be pumped back in, if you're not going to get it back in a little while.
Well, yeah. And I've even, thought about that, and got like those filtration things. But then I'm thinking, well, what is that going to do? If it's out for a year, that might help me last a little bit longer than the average person, but it's not going to solve the problem, and
Well,
I
and
think that's where a lot of us are at. It's like we're trying to be self-sufficient, but we just don't know what the hell we're doing, you know?
and and if the government was really interested in your health and saving you, why aren't they pushing that? Why did
Hmm.
they outlaw one of the really good water filters?
Yep.
It's like you got to be suspicious of these people who come in and yell that I'm going to save you, I'm going to save you. And then when you look at what they're doing to save you is just making you more reliant on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not being good. As a parent, you're both parents, right? Are you
I
No.
trying to
am.
make your
Yes.
child independent of you? Or are you trying to be a narcissistic parent and make sure that they're always dependent on you?
Right. No, that is such a good point, because I think about that all the time with the government, how when they do these tactics of, oh, I'm doing this to save you, I always think about that. I would never do this to my kid because I want my kid to be independent. I want them to be able to create, their own success and so on and so forth. And you can apply this to pretty much any issue that the government wants to save us on, but this especially. And that's where I feel like people like me are looking towards, like who, like, what do we do? Like, I want to learn this stuff. And like I said earlier, like I know so many people that are getting chickens and stuff. And I've talked about that with my parents. Like, we need to go and buy a plot of land and learn how to grow our own food and get some chickens. But I feel like talking about it and implementing it is it's not as easy as you think. Like there's so much knowledge that goes through that goes with that. So it's like someone like you that probably is more self-sustainable and, what advice would you give? Like, what do we do? What does someone like me do that has kids and wants to be prepared? Is there anything really that we can do when it all boils down to an EMP attack or like something like that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways you can work on it. Number one, it's like learning to drive a car. Do you guys remember when you first learned to drive a car?
My oldest just got her permit. So we're going through that right now.
Okay, so you know how scary it is.
Yep.
You have all these things you have to do at once, and it's like scary. But, my kids started driving cars when they were like 2 years old because they stood on your lap and they held the steering wheel and they just did the steering wheel. And we drove around out in the fields and they helped feed cattle and stuff like that. Then they got a little bigger and they could use the turn signal, and they got a little bigger and they could start shifting the gears and they got a little bigger. So don't look at it as having to learn it all at once. Look at it as taking just a little bit of something at a time. And the other side is evaluate where you're the most vulnerable. I mean, do I need water? Do I need backup food? How do I learn to do this? The government's not all bad. They do have some good stuff. Like there's the extension office that you can learn. There's programs through that you can learn. But the other thing is get to know your neighbors. Find out what their hobbies are. You would be surprised at the people out there that can, or the people out there that do grow gardens, or they do medicinal learning. I mean, they're out there. You need to get to know your neighbors, and if the shit hits the fan, those are the people that are either going to be your worst enemy or your best friend, is the people who are immediately around you, and you need to form good solid coalitions with these people. And then YouTube, I mean, it's not the greatest place, but it is an incredible source on learning how to do a ton of different things. I mean, type in canning, and I'm one of those that I love YouTube because I can learn a ton of things that I don't know how to do. But I'm also a person who learns best if somebody's teaching me.
Yeah.
So learn how to do it and then start asking people. It's amazing what senior citizens know. A lot of them lived through it, and some of them didn't, but a lot of them did. And you just ask them, how did you do this back in the day? How did you do this without electricity? How did you do this? Where did you get this from? One of the most interesting things that no one thinks about, how'd you feed your dog?
Yeah.
Everybody had a dog, but they didn't have dog food.
Mm.
How'd you feed your dog? Go through your life and say, where did you get water? How did you deal with water? How'd you deal with, your clothes? How did you deal with, long-term food storage? One of the things that I found amazing was eggs. We talk chickens and we talk eggs. How did they keep eggs long term? Your chickens only lay during the summer, at least here. Winter rolls around, they quit laying. Do you go through the whole winter without eggs?
No, you pickle them, right?
Well, you can, but the government says don't pickle eggs, they'll kill you. But interesting enough, you can buy pickled eggs in the grocery store.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, that's another BS thing that they like to push. But have you ever heard of glassing an egg?
No.
No.
So you can long-term store eggs by using pickling lime, quarter cup of pickling lime to a quart of water, and you take a raw egg that you have not cleaned. Don't clean it out of the chicken. She puts a nice little film over the top of it, and you put this into the solution and make sure it's covered. They are shelf stable for 12 months. You
Wow.
crack that baby open and it looks just like your egg that you got from your chicken yesterday. Plus, do you know that you can keep your eggs on your counter for 4 weeks without refrigeration,
No.
as long
Yes.
as you don't clean it,
Mm-hmm.
because
Oh
of
my
that nice little
gosh.
coating the chicken puts on it. So you don't need refrigeration to keep your eggs. You have to from the grocery store because they wash them off. But
Mhm.
if you can buy eggs and get eggs from somebody, down the road, they are shelf stable. You don't need refrigeration.
That's what my neighbor told me. And I would get eggs from her chickens all the time. And she said, don't clean them, leave them out on the counter until you're ready to use them.
Yeah, I've never heard that in my life. And this is what I mean. It's like stuff like this. I'm so hungry to know. And I was just talking about this with my grandma. So my parents and my grandma live in my neighborhood. We see each other every day. That's very, very abnormal for my generation. You know what I mean? But the way we live now, like that's how it used to be. And that's how knowledge was continually passed down from generation to generation. And I feel like that's gone for so many of us because, of the way our society's set up and we kind of like leave home and never really reconnect or like live together and learn from our parents, our grandparents. It's like we've lost so much knowledge, but I feel like now this younger generation is hungry for that knowledge and wants to learn what they can do because they realize. I feel like a lot of people have realized what the government is up to and they want to make sure they're self-sustainable. So
Well,
learning,
I hope they realize what the government's up to, because I mean, what for one thing, the government went, you can't take your kid to school. Well, how does your kid learn, or you can't take your kid to work? So how does your kid learn to work if you can't take them with you?
yep.
They don't want you taking your kids anywhere with you unless it's to a sporting event. And then you're expected to sit on the sideline. You can't participate with them. Everything about our society right now pushes separating you from your child.
Hmm.
We don't want you teaching them anything, and we don't want you participating. We want your child not dependent on you in any way, shape, or form. Well, when I was a kid, and I mean, I'm not ancient, but my, how do you think I learned to drive a semi at 18? My dad took me with him everywhere. We trucked with him as a kid. That's what we do. He'd get us up early in the morning. We wanted to go with dad. We'd truck up with him, get a load of fuel, and come back. I mean, we learned what it meant to sit in a semi all day long.
Yeah.
So when it came time to get licenses, it was no big deal. We understood the job. My dad took us out on the oil field. We helped drill water wells when I was a kid. We learned to work. I mean, I didn't go to school to learn to weld, but I know how to weld. I didn't go to school to mechanic, but I was a mechanic for several years on snowcats. Our parents, our family teaches us these things. The school system doesn't. Have you seen a canning class in school?
Nope.
When did they get rid of home economics? They used to teach cooking and sewing.
Mhm.
Well, we don't teach that now because we don't want you to know how to do that. So if you're not hanging out with your grandparents, and right now, when you go to the grandparents' house, the kids, what do? Oh, I need to take the kids down to the rec center. I need to take the kids to the pool, or I need to take, it's not like let's bake cookies. It's not like let's can this thing up. It's not like let's work in the garden.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, everything you're saying, I talk about this all the time, especially with my mom, because she's very involved in my kid's life. But, you know, obviously I'm around a lot of other parents. And the norm now is exactly what you said. It's like we have to have a schedule. And I mean, God forbid your kid is bored or doesn't have something to do for an hour. Like you've got activity after activity after activity after sport. And some of the most valuable things that a kid will learn, they learn when they're bored, and when they can think, or they could follow mom around and like see what she's doing in the kitchen. And I totally agree with that. And gosh, like I feel like we could go down a whole rabbit hole with this, but like, have you heard about, like the whole feminist movement um in the 60s and how people think that the government kind of like pushed that, because what ended up happening was then the mom goes to work now all day, and now they have kids at an even younger age that can be conditioned in schooling. And I don't know. I agree with that. I think that's been a big problem. It's separated, again, like it's separated kids from their mother and kind of like messed with the family unit.
Oh, I agree with it completely. I mean, they push, you need a bigger house, you need a better car, you need this, you need that, so that you need more money, so that let's get you out of the house. And then who's raising the children? If you're not at home with your kids, who's raising your kid? What kind of moral standard are they putting into your kid? What are you teaching the kid? When we had our children, we weren't making very much money, but we made the decision that we had our kids to raise, not for someone else to raise. And we didn't take a vacation for 15 years. But why do you need a vacation from your life if your life is any good? And if your life is so bad that you need a vacation from it, you need to rethink your life. You need to get a better life. I mean, one of the worst things is you have 18 years with your kids, period. After that, it's done. Are you teaching them that money matters more than your time for them? Because if you're working a ton of overtime so you can buy them something, then you're teaching them money matters more than they do. If you ask people, who is the most important adult in your life? Who is your favorite adult from childhood? They'll say, well, it's grandma or grandpa, or it was this or that, or it was my uncle. And it's like, why? And they'll be like, well, they played ball with me, or they took me fishing, or they would sit and read. What one of those things is money oriented? Every single one of them is about time. So what's the government want to take away from you with your kids? Time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. That's so well put. Glenda, I have a business like outside of this podcast. You want to know what my tagline is? Manifest a life you don't need a vacation from. Like,
perfect.
Just build that life now so you don't have to escape, twice a year from it and enjoy like one little vacation. So yeah, we're on the same page on like so many levels. I feel like we could talk all day. But I won't keep you all day.
No, I got to go cut some ears off of a tag so my husband can help put up a timber frame.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks for coming on. I mean, I feel like we went in so many directions, but that's what I love about it. Like that it's not just one thing. It's the whole big picture of what's happening here. And I think that's really important to start waking people up and realizing like, hey, I've got to learn how to be more self-sufficient, and I'm not going to buy in to the fear that the government's selling. So I really appreciate that. So many words of wisdom. Like I want to go back through this and like look at each one, because this was great.
I started taking notes.
Oh, good. Yeah. So thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for inviting me. It was fun. I enjoyed visiting with you guys.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll probably have you on again in the future, but we'll definitely be in touch. And thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next time. If you're sick of all the crazy shit going on in our country and you want to express your support and patriotism for the show, head on over to our Etsy store at UO Patriot Chicks and check out our new stickers. The link can also be found on our website. If you love the show and you want exclusive episodes, support the podcast and join the conversation by becoming a member of our Patreon community. We'll be posting weekly member-only podcast episodes and content that isn't available on the weekly podcast. Every Patreon member will also get a free Unapologetically Outspoken sticker and updates about our new sticker release before they're made public. And be sure to follow us on TikTok at Unapologetically Outspoken. And if you haven't done so already, please rate and review the podcast. The more you support us, the more people we can reach. So help us spread the word.